Napoleon Bonaparte's role in the history of France and indeed all of Europe is simply enormous. A statesman who not only laid the foundations of the modern French state, but also forever changed the face of the entire continent. Some historians often call Napoleon the first person to unite Europe, although the price of this unification turned out to be extremely high. However, first and foremost, of course, Napoleon became famous as an unparalleled military commander and a strategic genius. During his military career, he fought in more than 60 battles, and only in a few of them did he fail to achieve victory. Bonaparte created the best army of his time, vastly superior to his opponents. And in this episode, we will talk about how Napoleonic soldiers lived, how much salary they received, what they ate, and how they spent their time. In addition, you will learn a lot of interesting things about the organization of Napoleon's Grand Army, the order that reigned within it, and the most famous commanders of the French Emperor. My name is Semyon, and I declare the section How Did They Live open. Let's begin. Napoleon and the French army. Napoleon had to build the French army practically from scratch. When he was preparing for his first serious campaign in Italy, his soldiers looked more like a band of ragged men than a capable regular army. Funding was minimal, and even the money allocated from the treasury never reached the soldiers. It was simply stolen by the quartermasters. The troops were starving and dressed in whatever they could find. When Bonaparte had just arrived at the army, he was informed that one of the battalions had refused to carry out the order to relocate to another area, because none of the soldiers had boots. Napoleon immediately and harshly began to fight theft, using the strictest measures for this. "We often have to execute by shooting," he wrote in his reports to Paris. This practice quickly bore fruit. There was less stealing. But even more importantly, it immediately raised Napoleon's authority among the common soldiers, who fiercely hated their embezzling commanders. Of course, Napoleon not only fought against theft, but also improved the organization of his army, introduced new tactical methods, and carefully selected his command staff. For example, the main feature of the French army, which is personally attributed to Napoleon, was the so-called corps system. The essence of it was that all the troops were divided into corps, which included infantry units, cavalry units, artillery, engineers, and support services. Such a corps could operate independently, separate from the main army forces, and the corps were commanded by the most outstanding marshals and generals. Napoleon had an excellent understanding of people, so he surrounded himself with a whole group of individuals brilliantly gifted in military affairs. His commanders were different, but all of them without exception possessed persistence, the ability to quickly assess the situation, intuition and military instinct, and the ability to make decisions promptly. And most importantly, Napoleon's marshals understood his intentions instantly and could develop them independently. The most elite unit of the Grand Army was the Guard. Its soldiers were excellently trained and prepared. In battles, the French infantry used a new combat principle based on a combination of skirmishers deployed in a chain and infantry columns. It replaced the linear tactics that had been used earlier. Significant changes also took place in cavalry tactics. For example, Napoleon introduced attacks in columns. He was the first to form cavalry into separate units made up of several divisions, that is, into cavalry corps, which were distinguished by their power and maneuverability. They were used to capture enemy troops, raid their rear, and break through enemy defenses. Artillery also underwent changes. France traditionally had one of the best artilleries in Europe, and Napoleon strengthened it even further. By using lighter carriages for field guns, he turned artillery into a universal weapon of unprecedented power. In many battles, the success of the fight depended on the emperor's skillful placement of the cannons. The morale and attitude of the soldiers toward Napoleon. Napoleon's army was strong not only because of its organization and talented commanders, but also because of its highest morale, which made it invincible. Even their opponents recognized the resilience and courage of the French soldiers. The fighters of the French Republic fought for the ideals of the revolution. They defended their country from foreign invasions and interventionists. It's no wonder that their fighting spirit was extremely high. Under Napoleon, the main motivation for the soldiers became patriotism. They sincerely believed that they were fighting for the greatness of their country. Napoleon's army was proud of its mission, and serving in it was considered an honorable privilege. General Foix recalled that the army became the flower of the people, the purest blood of France. The nation became the army, and the army became the nation. Any display of cowardice in Napoleon's army was despised, and it was especially intolerable among the officers. The officer corps of the French army was filled with ambition, a sense of honor, and a thirst for glory. Contempt for death was considered the norm. Officers flaunted their bravery on the battlefield, and the expression, "not to bow to enemy cannonballs and bullets," was taken literally. Here we can recall the saying of Marshal Lannes, who personally led his troops into attack many times. Once he said that a hussar who isn't killed by the age of 30 isn't a hussar but a coward. 2 years after that, Lannes fell on the battlefield, struck down by an enemy cannonball. Therefore, an officer suspected of cowardice in Napoleon's army was completely ostracized and often immediately stripped of his position and sent to the rear. This was considered a terrible disgrace. Napoleon himself repeatedly demonstrated examples of composure and fearlessness under fire. It was like that at the Arcole Bridge when he, as a young general, led his soldiers into the attack. It was the same at the Eylau cemetery when Napoleon stood for hours with his troops under the hurricane fire of the artillery of the Russian Empire. Similar sentiments prevailed among the lower ranks as well. They were driven forward by a thirst for glory, honors, and awards, but even more by a sense of honor. And honor demanded moving forward together with their comrades, facing danger, and not leaving them behind for any reason. Let me give you a few examples. On the eve of Austerlitz, a non-commissioned officer was punished with a one-day arrest for poor uniform appearance, which deprived him of the opportunity to take part in the battle. He said that he was ready for even harsher punishment, but only after the battle. "I don't want to be dishonored," the soldier said. At the beginning of the Prussian campaign, sick guards, cavalry chasseurs jumped out of the hospital windows to go on campaign with the army during the Polish campaign of 1807. Straggling soldiers, hungry, battered by cold and exhaustion, would rush forward at the very first cannon shots, trying at all costs to catch up with their comrades and take part in the battle with them. It's hard for a modern person to understand, but the soldiers and officers of Napoleon's army looked forward to war with anticipation, and the announcement of a new campaign was met with excitement among the troops. It can't be said that there were no cowards in the French army, but they had two options: either desert or grit their teeth and move forward together with their comrades. What is the reason for such high morale in the French army? In fact, there are several. While in other European armies of that time officers were usually nobles, in France after the Revolution this barrier was broken, and any literate soldier could quite possibly become an officer and in general build a decent career. This greatly motivated the soldiers. Napoleon liked to say that every soldier carries a marshal's baton in his backpack, and this was absolutely true. Many of his generals and marshals came from the very bottom. By the way, studying at military institutes was free, and it also came with a decent stipend. While whips and corporal punishment reigned in the armies of European monarchies, in Napoleon's army, officers respected their soldiers. It was normal for an officer or even a general to address an ordinary infantryman as comrade. Bonaparte did not allow corporal punishment in the army at all, because he believed that a dishonored soldier was incapable of fighting. A tribunal could sentence a serviceman to prison, hard labor, or even the death penalty, but it was forbidden to beat him. There was another institution in Napoleon's army that enjoyed special authority, the Comrades' Court. Here is how it worked. For example, two soldiers were not seen during an attack. They simply hid after the battle. The company selects 3 judges from among the veterans who sentence the cowards to be shot, and the sentence is carried out immediately. The officers know everything, but they do not interfere. Well, of course, besides punishments, there was also an entire system of rewards for servicemen in the French army, created by Napoleon, and French soldiers received decent pay. After just 1 year, an ordinary soldier could buy himself a house back home. But there were also bonuses that distinguished soldiers received, and the payment system was fair and closely monitored. Therefore, after serving a few years in Napoleon's army, a soldier could very well secure his future, if of course he survived. As for Napoleon's generals and marshals, they became some of the richest people in Europe. Another interesting point: before the campaign in Italy, Napoleon addressed his soldiers with these words: "Soldiers, you are poorly clothed and badly fed. I want to lead you to the most fertile lands in the world." Here he expressed to the soldiers one of his main principles, which he followed throughout his life. War must feed itself. Conquered countries were ruthlessly plundered and huge contributions were imposed on them. Ordinary soldiers could also count on trophies, which of course increased their motivation. It wasn't just about money. Napoleon established a whole series of awards, the main one being the Legion of Honor. For many soldiers, it was a more desirable reward than a promotion or monetary payments. The authority of Napoleon himself, as emperor and an outstanding commander, was of great importance to the French soldiers. Of course, it's easy to fall into a sentimental legend on this issue, which, thanks to the efforts of memoirists, appeared after Napoleon's death. Nevertheless, the soldiers truly loved their emperor, not only in times of victory, but also during times of defeat. There is no doubt that Napoleon found the key to a soldier's soul and knew how to influence him through personal example and passionate speech. He shared all the hardships and dangers of war with his soldiers and never shunned their company. For example, during the grueling march across the Egyptian desert, Napoleon ordered that all the horses be given up for transporting the sick and wounded. When an aide tried to give a horse to Bonaparte himself, he became furious and struck the officer across the face with his whip. "Everyone is to go on foot. I will go first. Didn't you hear the order? Out!" Once during a breakthrough while inspecting the guards, Napoleon found a sentry sleeping at his post. According to the laws of wartime, the soldier was supposed to face a court, which could very well have ended in execution. But Bonaparte did not wake the soldier. He took his rifle and stood guard in his place. When the guard shift arrived, the astonished sergeant saw the sleeping soldier and the emperor standing at the post. After handing over the weapon according to regulations, Napoleon ordered that the sleeping soldier not be punished. And dozens of similar cases can be recalled, and all of them became true legends, making the soldiers' attitude toward their emperor one of genuine adoration. The daily life of Napoleon's soldiers. The first thing a French peasant felt when joining Napoleon's army was relief from the constant feeling of hunger. Because for a person from the lower social classes at that time, undernourishment was a common thing. But in the French army, they made sure that the soldier was always well fed. A Napoleonic soldier ate twice a day, in the morning, around 10 o'clock, and late in the evening. The main dish was a nutritious liquid stew made of meat and vegetables, which was officially called soup. Depending on where the unit was located, the soup recipe could change. But the total amount of food and its approximate caloric value were followed quite strictly. Every day, a soldier received up to 8,000 calories, which was enough for marching on foot and other hard military work. If this supply worked properly, the personnel were satisfied. In the French army, they tried to introduce mobile field kitchens, but the innovation did not catch on. The soldiers cooked food in small groups of 6 to 8 people, which were called mess kits. Members of such groups not only ate together, but also arranged sleeping quarters, helped the wounded, and sent personal belongings and letters to their families. If someone from the mess kit group died on the battlefield, alcohol helped to ease the hardships of army life. Soldiers were usually given the cheapest brandy or vodka. Alcohol not only lifted spirits, but also disinfected water from questionable sources. Unlike other armies of that time, the French army did not use field tents, since they greatly burdened the supply train and gave French reconnaissance an excellent opportunity to estimate the size of the army. Only generals in the Napoleonic army had their own tents. The rest made do as best they could, building makeshift shelters or simply lying down to sleep by the fire, wrapped in their greatcoats. If the camp was set up for a long time, the soldiers stayed in wooden barracks. In Napoleon's army, hygiene in the camps was taken very seriously. Cleanliness was maintained and latrines were always set up. In peacetime, the troops lived in barracks or were quartered with the local population. The soldiers themselves much preferred the second option, but it was not always possible everywhere, since the relationship between Napoleon's army and the civilian population varied from place to place. During breaks between wars and campaigns, the soldiers and officers of the Grande Armée organized their leisure time as best they could. Officers visited cafes and restaurants, while the lower ranks preferred simpler and cheaper places. Card games were very popular, and both officers and soldiers played them with great enthusiasm. Officers were also fond of billiards and hunting. In many units of the Grande Armée, there were even amateur theatrical performances, and music was also greatly loved in Napoleon's army. Almost every regiment had its own orchestra. The beat of drums and the sounds of bugles and flutes accompanied the soldiers on the march, in battle, and during their rest. It was considered normal to perform marches and arias from popular operas during a halt, or to advance on the enemy to the sound of the orchestra. Napoleon himself loved the drum. He used to say that it never plays out of tune. Compared to other European armies, the French military stood out for its complete irreligiosity. There were no priests in the units, no prayer services were held, soldiers did not go to confession or take communion. For that time, this was considered barbaric. For example, the devout Spaniards believed that Napoleon's army was made up entirely of either pagans, Muslims, or simply heretics. In a way, reverence for their emperor replaced faith in God for French soldiers. Napoleon was truly idolized. They swore oaths in his name, and during military ceremonies involving the emperor, both soldiers and officers experienced a genuine religious ecstasy. Another interesting point is that Napoleon's army was extremely superstitious. No other army of that time spent as much money on talismans and amulets. They didn't believe so sincerely in omens and luck, so any bad sign or symbol could negatively affect the spirit of the troops. For example, after crossing the Niemen River, in the presence of thousands of soldiers, Napoleon's horse stumbled and threw its rider to the ground. The superstitious French considered this a bad omen given by fate at the very beginning of the campaign, and, as the future showed, they turned out to be absolutely right. Women in Napoleon's army. There were many women in Napoleon's army. Vivandières, cantinières, laundresses, prostitutes. Most often they were the wives of soldiers who decided to stay close to their husbands even during war. Women cooked and did the laundry, brightened up their leisure time, treated the wounded, and sometimes, along with the men, took direct part in combat. Yes, indeed, there are many known cases when these brave women not only brought vodka to the soldiers right in the thick of battle, but also took up arms themselves. For example, it was the Vivandières who saved the lives of two Napoleonic generals, Arnan and Lendru de Essar. The Vivandière Joséphine Trancard carried a wounded battalion commander from the battlefield, and in the process, she killed two enemy soldiers. For her feat, the woman received the Legion of Honor. The cantinière of the 57th Line Infantry Regiment, Madame Casajus, was awarded a gold chain for her bravery, presented directly by Napoleon himself. The laundress Marie Doran saved a drowning soldier during the crossing of the Piave River, for which General Bonaparte at the time gave her a gold necklace. The cantinière of the 1st Grenadier Regiment of the Imperial Guard, Marie, nicknamed Wooden Head, took part in 17 campaigns in Italy. In 1800, she had a son who later became a young drummer and died during the defense of Paris in 1814. Marie herself was killed in the Battle of Waterloo. In addition to vivandières, laundresses, and cooks, Napoleon's army also had women soldiers and even women officers who fought alongside men and did so just as well. For example, Marie Schelling, who rose to the rank of lieutenant, was personally awarded the Legion of Honor by Napoleon. At the same time, turning to his officers, he exclaimed, "Gentlemen, respectfully bow to this brave woman. She is one of the best soldiers of the empire." Epilogue. The era of the Napoleonic Wars is one of the most fascinating periods in European history. The Great French Revolution not only introduced a society free from class prejudices to the world, but also gave rise to an army based on entirely new principles. And it turned out to be literally a head above all its opponents. Of course, the figure of Napoleon himself played a huge role here, a true military genius and brilliant organizer. Napoleon's army was defeated only through the combined efforts of the rest of Europe, and even then only after several decades of bloody wars. Well, that's all from me for now. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.